So you have this identity that is based in the Bible that Christians cling to in Iran. There are a number of books in the Old Testament that address Iran in the Bible. You have the tombs of Cyrus the Great, Darius the Great, Xerxes and Xerxes. Some would argue even Esther and Mordecai and Daniel. It was because of the Iranian government, funny enough, that allowed them to return and build a second temple. And you have all this, and this is pervasive throughout Iranian history.
Today, I'm excited to welcome Dr. Philip Hopkins. Dr. Hopkins holds dual doctorates, a PhD in applied theology from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in North Carolina, and a PhD in Iranian history from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. He has taught at several institutions, including Russian Armenian University in Yerevan, Southeastern Seminary and Southwestern Seminary, and he has also served as a research associate with the Center of World Christianity at SOAS, University of London. Dr. Hopkins is a widely published scholar. His research focuses especially on Christianity in Iran during and after Pahlavi's era, with attention to Armenian and Assyrian communities, Christian nationalism, and legacy of Western missionary activity in Iran. This work grows out of years of engagement with Iranian culture, beginning with the candlelight vigil in Tehran after 9/11, where the first began fostering dialogue with Iranians on questions of faith, history, and identity. Dr. Hopkins, thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed reading your essay on Iran's ethnic Christians. It's full of details that connect Bible, church history, and Persian culture in such a unique way. What stood out to me as I read it was how many of those connections are often overlooked when people talk about Christianity in Iran. Before we dive into the main set of questions that I have for you, I'd love to ask you something a bit more open. When you were researching and writing this essay, was there one discovery, one story, or even one detail that really surprised you? Something that, shifted the way you personally understood Christianity's history in Iran? And I think it'd be great that we start there because it helps us see what shaped your perspective as the author of this essay.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting question. What I wrote on was based on research I was doing for a second PhD in Iranian history at the University of St. Andrews. And anytime you do a PhD, there's certain parts of the research that you can include, and there's certain parts that you just can't because it just doesn't fit the overall thesis. This is one of the aspects of my dissertation that didn't really fit the overall thesis. But I found it interesting because, as you know, before 1979, there were very, very few born-again Christians in Iran that were from Muslim backgrounds. But you had you had a lot of Western investment. Iran was open to the West, and missionaries were there all over the place. But very little was happening. But you still had these groups of people, the Armenians and the Assyrians, that were there and that were robust in their faith. And I didn't know a lot about them, just where they stood theologically, why the Armenians were able to persevere versus the Assyrians, who just weren't, with Timur coming in and just doing what he did, wiping out a lot of the Assyrian population. But the Armenians were able to stay. And living in Armenia and working with Armenians, I had a bit of an affinity towards them. Just I wanted to research this a little bit more. So that's a long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
Yes. And as I was talking to you off the camera, your work is a wealth of information that I'm looking forward to read and learn from you. And I really appreciated you being here and share what you have found out and you studied with our audience. And in your essay, you mentioned that the Old Testament speaks well of Persia, particularly referring to Cyrus as a God's Messiah. Now, how has this view influenced Iranian Christian identity throughout the history?
Well, I think it's not only influenced Iranian Christian identity. I believe it's influenced Iranian identity because, as you know, there are a number of books in the Old Testament that address Iran in the Bible. You have the tombs of Cyrus the Great, Darius the Great, Xerxes, and Xerxes. Some would argue even Esther and Mordecai and Daniel. You have all these biblical figures, and then during the Achaemenid period, we see that the policies that allowed for religious freedom in Iran allowed for the Jews to return to their homeland, because they were part of the Babylonian captivity. They came into Iran, and then it was because of the Iranian government, funny enough, that allowed them to return and build the Second Temple. And you have all this, and this is pervasive throughout Iranian history. And you could even today, as you know, you go to Isfahan and you go to the Julfa area in Isfahan, and there are Armenian Bibles in Iran displayed that date back, hundreds of years, far before the Textus Receptus, and we think that in the West is a pretty big deal, but nothing compared to what they have in Iran. So you have this identity that is based in the Bible that Christians cling to in Iran, and not only Christians, but also we see Mohammad Reza Shah connected back to this period, and so did Ayatollah Khomeini, and just some of his policies that he implemented, like the Valiant Fiqh. You have the Mohammad Reza Shah and the Divine Right of Kings. You have all these different things that just make this identity of Christianity in the Bible just really just replete and pronounced. And I think that has helped the Iranian Christians be able to persevere during some significant times of trouble.
Now, you also mentioned that by the 5th century, Iran had a theological school where they studied theology. How that setting changed Iranian theology or theology of Iranians comparing to the Roman world?
Okay, that's actually a really good question. Now, within Iran, you have within Greater Iran, you have theological schools like Edessa and Nispasis. Now, both were in what we call Iran today, more in Greater Iran. But these schools promoted a type of theology that was quite different than Western theology. Edessa and Nispasis were both associated with a theological belief called Nestorianism in the writings of Theodore Mopsuestia. In many respects, it is because of these. For those who don't know, Nestorianism differs from what people in the West would ascribe to when it comes to understanding of Jesus. Now, both Nestorianism and Chalcedon, they both believe Jesus is 100% God, 100% man, but there was a bit of a nuance to the Nestorian position, which is what the Church of the East ended up picking up and ascribing to. And because of that, they were able to develop a distinct identity. We know that Nispasis, for example, is considered to be the world's first university. They were able to establish schools. They were able to do a number of different things that would allow them to be different than the West. In fact, we see that there was so much concern that there was this. It ended up getting political in some respects, and that led to a whole lot. That's a whole different story altogether. But I think the Nestorian theology, based on what the Church of the East developed, was the main reason.
What's interesting to me as well was Iran back then, around that time, was very missional, and we've heard the stories of Iranians sending missionaries as far as China.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, how they were able to, people think, the modern missions movement, think William Carey, and rightfully so. William Carey is in many ways the godfather or the father of the Protestant modern missions movement. But missions started far before that. It started with funny enough, with the Church of the East, and with Islam coming into Iran. The Church of the East, what did it do? Islam's coming from the West, largely from Saudi Arabia and all that.
Yes.
And what did Greater Iran do? The Christians went to places like India, China, Sri Lanka. I've heard reports of the Church of the East going as far as Japan, and that is the Iranians were able to take their faith in the midst of persecution and do some wonderful things inside of Iran, but also they were not afraid to share the faith. And
what's interesting to me, Dr. Hopkins, it's when we talk about the history of the church in Iran, and we talk about them being Nestorian, and then based on today's classic theology, we deem them kind of a heretic. Nowadays maybe Nestorians are not accepted as an Orthodox Christianity, but they were committed and they were zealous about their faith, and that's how they not only cared about where they lived, preached the gospel, but also took the gospel to four corners of the world.
They did, and just for those who don't know what Nestorianism is, and I imagine most people don't, but what Nestorianism does, there's a lot of things, but in essence, when it comes to the understanding of Jesus, is Nestorianism separates two persons in Christ. They're fully divine and a fully human person. Now, that differs from Chalcedon, which articulates something a little bit different in a sense that it ascribes Christ as both fully divine in two natures, but without confusion, without change, without division. That's the whole hypostatic union. Yes. So there's a bit of a difference. I very much believe that people that are of the Nestorian faith, they believe that Jesus is 100% man, 100% God, right? I mean, if they're not, it's not Arianism where Jesus is 50% man, 50% God. No, so I think this idea of Nestorianism being a heresy is a bit overplayed. Right. And I've actually talked to some systematic theology professors, some whom we know, and I've asked them this question when I was overseas, and they're like, no, that's more of a political designation than it was anything, because
right.
As well as I do,
right.
These things, they don't happen in a vacuum. There's politics involved, yes. And a lot of it was I believe, more politics than it was theology.
I'm very thankful that you mentioned that. That's a part of the Christian theology we really tend to ignore when it comes to the politics and all that. But by the early 200s, Christianity in Iran was growing. They already had tombs, and there were churches built there, and then I believe they had many bishops, as many as I think 20 bishops there. How does that speak about how fast Christianity was being spread in Iran back in those days?
Yeah, I think Roland Allen, who's a missiologist from a different generation, talks about the spontaneous expansion of the church. He's written a book about this, and I think within Iran, you see the spontaneous expansion of the church. It wasn't manipulated by programs or by anything else. It's just the Lord chose to expand the church in His way. Now, theologically, I can give you an answer for that. Sociologically, maybe not so much. God's going to do what God's going to do in His time and His way. I also think, though, if you look at the majority faith at the time, people were pretty frustrated with it. And it wasn't Islam, it was Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism, again, is one of those faiths that many people don't know about, but it's a monotheistic faith that was the majority faith in Iran during this time. And Iranians were a bit frustrated with what was going on during this time during the Parthian Empire. And when people see truth, they gravitate towards it, and sometimes they rebel against it. But with the Iranians' case, they gravitated towards it, and the Lord blessed that.
You talk about year 410 when the Church of East kind of broke away from the Roman world, and then they set their headquarters in Tisfun. But let me ask you before continuing this question: the Church of the East and the Church of the Church in Iran, are they same thing, or are two separate identities when it comes to that?
Okay, well, the Church of the East is part of Christianity in Iran. Within Christianity in Iran today, you have the Armenians who are more monophysite. They're part of the Church of the East, but they're not. They're the exact opposite, funny enough, of the Nestorian theology. So you have the Armenians that have been around since the 1500s. You have the Nestorians. There's some Catholics that have been there since right around the 1500s too, with the Portuguese coming in. Right. And then you have this large growing Protestant, I guess for lack of a better term, Protestant faith that was brought in by missionaries, and when the missionaries left, a lot of the Iranians kind of gravitated toward that. So,
Right.
if you want to just look at it, it was really more the Assemblies of God who were doing things the right way. As much as I'd like to say it was Baptist or Presbyterian, it was Assemblies of God. They really
Right.
focused on indigenous work.
Yes.
And what has happened currently in Iran, after 79, is that all the Western people left, and the Iranian faith, before that time, it was critiqued as being more of a foreign religion or a religion of certain ethnicities. But when God used the Islamic Republic to, in many ways, you wouldn't think this, but God used the Islamic Republic in taking out the West to make Christianity more indigenous. Now, as you know, and as your followers probably know, is that largely the church in Iran the services are conducted in Persian, which before they weren't, and now also they're more focused on more like the house church model. Now there's theologically you can argue is that the best model or not, but that is what has been used, and the Lord has used that, and God has blessed that, because I think very much so.
Yes.
Churches and homes is the way that the early church began. Right, it met in people's homes. It didn't be in a building with a white picket fence and a steeple.
Yes. Going back to the question I was asking, so to 410, when the Church of Iran, or Church of the East, basically moved its headquarters to Tisfun, do you think that started or initiated some sort of identity shift, and also theological shift for the Church of Iran?
Yeah, 410 was a big deal. I mean, very much a big deal when you had this council. They did a number of different things, and Zelasiya Ctesiphon. It very much united the Persian Church, the Church of the East, and established Zelasiya Ctesiphon as the head, as the see of the church. It led to it developed. It allowed for the church to organize its own leadership that was independent of the Roman Empire. Later on, a few years later, there was a document, I believe it's 424, that stated they're only answerable to God alone and not to a foreign power, which I think was really important. It really became the evangelical hub as well, because it's from Ctesiphon where extensive missionary work was able to be carried out into regions like Persia, Iran, and India.
Yes.
This is also where theologically they developed a lot of their distinctives that were based on Theodore Mopsuesia's theological position. Now, the Church of the East would say they're not Nestorian; they follow more Theodore Mopsuesia, but Nestorius also followed Theodore Mopsuesia as well. So there's a bit of an overlap there. But it's super, super important. And as you know, about right around 800 AD, the see ended up transferring to from Ctesiphon and ended up going to modern day Baghdad because it was a bit more of a central location.
Dr. Hopkins just reminded us of something amazing. Persia's story weaves right through the Bible, and today faith in Iran is becoming truly homegrown, spreading house to house. We at Heart for Iran are privileged to serve that movement with Farsi scriptures, secure ways to grow in faith, care for tired leaders, and media that speaks to the heart of Iranian culture. Would you consider partnering with us? Visit heartforiran.com to learn more. Your prayers and generosity will help seekers connect Scripture with their history and identity, strengthening the Iranian Church. Join our family at heartforiran.com. Thank you so much for standing with these incredible believers.
I think it was Samuel Moffat quoted that they murdered 200,000 Christians back then. That is I just couldn't understand. I mean, that is such a big number back then. I always thought the persecution, comparing what's happening to now, was way smaller, but that number was amazing. How did the Iranian Christians back then persevere through these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, when I use Moffat as this when I teach church history, and when I teach church history, especially church history one, most of what we read is more focused on what was going on in the West, as we're in the West, and that makes sense. But I think most people forget that a lot of Christianity, there's a lot going on with Christianity in the East, and Moffat brings this out, especially Christianity in Asia. And that number, 200,000, it's all the more staggering when you realize the population of the time was not nearly what it was today. 200,000 is probably closer to 2 million or 20 million. Right. Now with today's standards, is a whole lot more. And how are they able to persevere? Well, Iranian Christians throughout their history have persevered. There's been times of persecution, times where things have been not so bad. But the Lord has just used them and allowed them to persevere. I think personally, it was because the Lord was preparing them to go and be missionaries. I think that the Nestorian Church, the Church of the East, was in development, and God wanted to persevere this church in Iran so they could be a witness to other people, like going to places like China. So when Islam came in, the persecution, funny enough, was actually a little bit less, but they were used to some of the hardships because that's what they were under already, and that's just Christianity. I think some people, people in the West, we forget what 2 Timothy 3:12 says: all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Now, people in Iran, the Christians in Iran, that they live that, and I think that's something we in the West can really learn from.
And then there was another part in the essay that was very amazing. You were talking about Mar Abba. The story of that person, it tells me that the Church of Iran was not just surviving Christians. They were an active, live force in the region and even their own society.
Oh, very much so, very much so. I mean, you could see some of the if you look into the documents, that many of the translators, many of the doctors, many of the advisors to the Iranian kings, Iranian shahs, were Christian, even though the Iranian shahs and kings were not. They were Zoroastrianism, they were Zoroastrian, they were Muslim, but they very much trusted Christians because Christians were honest. And with Mar Abba, as you know, he was a Zoroastrian. He's originally of the Zoroastrian faith, and he converted to Christianity. And he was quite influential in a lot of things. There's some of his theological translations. He translated a lot of the key Greek text into the language that into Syriac, which is the language of the Church of the East. He was Nestorian. He theologically would agree with that position, but he had Bible commentaries. He was able to restore church unity, and he was very okay with just connecting people and developing a sense of unity that perhaps wasn't there before him. And as a result, the Nestorians, they persecuted him, and he ended up dying. He ended up dying because of torture. So he lived out his faith. He was an academic, similar to Paul, who lived out his faith and ended up, being tortured for it. Paul was an academic Jew who converted to Christianity, and Mar Abba was quite an influential, important, intelligent person from the Zoroastrian faith, and he fought against it, and he ended up costing him his life.
What a rich history of Christianity in Iran. I mean, these are information and a history that not only the Western world doesn't know, the Iranians are not aware of it. It seems like nobody is allowed to read and have access to this amazing information. Nowadays, when Islam is kind of going bankrupt in Iran, a lot of people are turning away from Islam. They're looking back to their roots, and what they find or what they think there is Zoroastrianism. But Christianity has such an amazing root. But let me ask you a question about, now that Islam came up, when the Muslims conquered, and they forced a religion upon Iranians. It seemed like Christian leaders at some point, they accepted the rules over the country and kind of alluded to this thing that it was God appointed. They were very open, it seemed like, to them.
Yeah, it's funny that you did mention that, because that's very much the case. In fact, I think one Christian, one influential Christian, was actually very much, I know that it may be hyperbole, but he very much welcomed Islam's prophet Muhammad in what he was trying to do and how he's trying to come into Iran, because the majority faith at the time, the Zoroastrians, were quite corrupt, and they were doing a number of different things that were harmful to Christians. So when the Islamic faith came in the beginning, the Muslims were the minority. They may have conquered the land, but they didn't have the ability right away to conquer the people or to change the people's hearts. That took some time, and we know now, obviously, we see where Islam is in Iran. But they had to control the people. They had to placate the people. So what the Muslims did, very smart. They took the policies that were in the Sasanian Empire, and they Islamicized them. So instead of, if you're a Zoroastrian, you have X, Y, and Z rights, and if you're not Zoroastrian, you don't. Well, they put those rights more towards Muslims, and if you wanted to be a Christian, you were very much a second-class citizen. But even so, it was still better than it was under the Zoroastrianism, at least in the later part of Zoroastrian history. We also see we talked off camera about H.P. Tafti, and he talks about this. He was the first Anglican bishop of Persian origin. He talks about poetry and how poetry is such an important role in Iranian society, and how during this time there was very much a kind-heartedness towards Christianity in Iranian poetry. So if you look at Ferdowsi and Khayyam and Hafez, The Religion of Love and Hafez is a book that was written a number of years ago by a guy named, I believe, Leonard Lewitson, and he talks about this and how he's a secular guy, I think, out of Exeter, University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, and he talks about this. He connects Christianity a little bit. He doesn't spend a whole lot of time on it, but he connects Hafez in his understanding of Islam, which may have been heterodox, but he connects it to Christianity and how Hafez has such a warm understanding of the faith. And we don't see that a lot. Most people don't in the West. Americans don't even know who Hafez is. But as you know, Hafez's work, the Divin, is considered to be the Bible of Iranian culture in many respects.
Yes.
There's a lot there that you can see a warm-heartedness towards the Christian faith in there. And just to further this up a little bit, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but under the Islamic times, almost every Iranian Shah up to the 13th century had a Christian first doctor. To the 11th century, the majority of translators were Christian. Into the 10th century, most of the philosophers are Christian. So even during this Islamic period, Christianity, while it was not the majority faith, while it was persecuted in certain degrees, it still had this major impact.
Now, let's talk about Armenians. I am from ethnically Armenian. I was born in Iran, grew up there until 21 years old of age. And when I look back to Armenian history, the church, I don't see a lot of activity going on during when I was alive, and it was a national church and not much of evangelism going on. But I know going back, Shah Abbas moved Armenians to Iran. That's why a lot of Armenians now are in the country of Iran, and they started building, churches, schools. They've done a lot of things in Iran. Did their presence in Iran change the face of Christianity, or did they normalize Christianity? Did they do something that it contributed to not only the growth of Christianity, but also shaping the Christianity today? Yeah,
let me just provide a little bit of background. We all know about today about this of Nakhchivan, where Nakhchivan is part of Azerbaijan right now. Well, we know there's been a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over another area called Artsakh. But this Western enclave called Nakhchivan, that is part of Azerbaijan now, used to be largely populated by Armenians. But around 1530 or so, the Safavid Empire started to transport Armenians from Armenia proper in Nakhchivan into Iran. Now, there was roughly about 80 to 100 years of this transport until roughly the early 1600s, where there ended up being, because of all these transferences, about 300,000 Armenians who ended up going into Iran. They settled in a number of different areas. I mean, they were spread out, so it wasn't just in Esfahan and Julfa that was like where the main place was, but there are also other places. So Armenians are throughout, as you know, throughout all of Iran. And I think it was by 1630 there were 80,000 just in the Julfa area in Esfahan, and it was funny that if you look at what happened, the first thing that was ever printed in Iran was from the Armenians, and it was the Old Testament Book of Psalms. So the first ever thing, which is funny. You never think that, and because you think during this time, this is the time that 12-verse Judaism became the state religion in Iran, but the first book ever printed was the Old Testament Book of Psalms. And there's I could go into a whole lot more detail with that, but I'll wait for some more questions. But yeah, I mean, the Armenians, I love Armenia. They speak Eastern Armenian, which is different than Western Armenian, which they speak in Turkey. Eastern Armenian is what they speak in Armenia. That's what they speak in Iran. So when we used to go to Iran, we go to Julfa and we go to the Armenian sections, and their chocolate baklava. Oh, do you remember the chocolate baklava in Esfahan? Oh man, that is. If you've never had that, if anyone could ever get me some chocolate covered baklava, that is the. I've never had better dessert than the chocolate-covered baklava. Turkey's baklava is great, but it makes no match with the chocolate-covered baklava.
They bring up a lot of memories to me. Thank you. In your conclusion, your book, you compare the Assyrian Church that kind of moved eastward, and you talk about Armenians who kind of blended into the society of Iran. What can these two models teach us about sharing and living out Christianity in Iran today?
Yeah, I think what the Church of the East, the Assyrian Church, did was commendable. But I think what the Armenian Church did is commendable as well. I think they could learn from one another. You can't just live out your faith and not talk about it, which is kind of the critique of the Armenian Church in Iran. At the same point, you can't just tell people about Jesus and then that's all you do. You need to be able to practice your faith, and people need to know people know you by your love for one another. So I think as Christianity becomes more indigenous in Iran, the Muslim background believers that are currently in Iran can look to what the Armenians did, how they honored God by their work. They honored God by being honest. The Shah Abbas, he wanted to use Armenians over other peoples because they were skilled at what they did. We need to honor God with our work. And that is what the Armenians did, and they were respected. And they still maintained their faith. They didn't evangelize as much as we would argue, obviously. And the Church of the East did, but when the Church of the East left, God put the Armenians there, and the Church of the East had profound impact on internationally. But I think you need both. You need to be able to share your faith, and you need to be able to live it out. And I think with the Church of the East and with the Armenian Church in Iran, you see both. You take those two combined, and I think you have a wonderful recipe. And it just as the church in Iran is becoming more indigenous, I think that the Christian leaders in Iran, who are especially from Muslim backgrounds, can look to their history and just be reminded of what the Lord has already accomplished through the church.
I'm sure you are connected to the Church of Iran today. You have heard a lot of reports. So we have common mutual friends, and Iranian circles. How do you see the Church of Iran today? Are you hopeful about the growth of Church of Iran as far not only as far as the numbers, but also as far as the theology goes? Where do you see the Church of Iran stands today?
Well, the Church of Iran is you know, I mean, there's been different reports about its growth, especially in the last number of years. And some would argue that just percentage-wise, you know, Iran being roughly 90 million people, that there are more people in Iran converting to Christianity inside of Iran than anywhere else, percentage-wise. Now you have like China and India that are a billion people, so they're, you could, numbers-wise, perhaps, they may be ahead of Iran, but percentage-wise, Iran is one of the fastest-growing places where Christianity is, and I think that's good. But I think we need to be patient as well. I mean, it took Protestants 1,500 years to get to Martin Luther, and they had to really just wrestle through a lot of these theological issues. And with the Church in Iran now, largely coming from a Muslim background, we need to give them time and let them time. We need to be able to. We need to be patient. They need to be patient with themselves, and I think as time goes by, they're going to be wrestling with questions that their brothers and sisters in Christ, the Assyrian Church and the Armenian Church, have wrestled. And with now the world being a bit more of a globalized, they have some resources that perhaps others didn't in times past. And I think those resources are great, but my concern is that the Iranian church in Iran needs to stay indigenous. I think that is what has allowed it to grow. They need to develop their own theology that is orthodox, lowercase o, but it needs to be it needs to be orthodox, sure, but it also needs to be contextual. And finding that balance is something that it's going to take some time. But I'm very encouraged. I've said this before if I could live anywhere in the world, even today going on with what's going on, I'd move to Iran. I mean, I love the people of the country. I still dream in Farsi, not as much anymore now that I'm in California, but man, the people of Iran, there's nothing that's, how do I say this? The country of Iran is beautiful, but the people of Iran are more beautiful than the country. So very, very love the people of Iran.
Very insightful conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. And you took us back to the history and show us the roots of Christianity in Iran. And you are telling us and showing us how it matters today. Thank you very much, Dr. Hopkins, for spending time today with me and with our audience. And hopefully it's, sometime in the near future, I'll have you back and we'll talk more about a lot of stuff that you're working on, and I'm sure our audience is going to want to hear and learn more about what you have researched on.
Hi, well, thank you for having me on, and I'm always glad to talk about Iran. I tell my students, you want to get me off topic, talk to me about Iran, and that'll get me off topic. And that is, I can talk about Iran all day with anybody and everybody. It's just such a very misrepresented part of the world in the West, and that's really unfortunate. That makes me really sad, but I'm glad there's people like you that are able to share the message. So thank you for having me on.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation. What we've heard today reminds us that the story of Christianity in Iran is part of a much greater history, one that stretches from the early church to the present moment, and one that is still being written today. At Heart for Iran, we believe God is using this moment in history to see the gospel take root and flourish in ways that once seemed impossible. We're here to be tools in His hands, standing with the church in Iran as it grows stronger and more resilient. If today's discussion opened your eyes to the deep connection between history, faith, and culture, I would love for you to stay connected with us. Subscribe to Unmuted so you don't miss future conversations like this one. And share this episode with a friend who wants to see Christianity flourish in Iran. And if you're ready to be part of the greater history, visit heartforiran.com. Your partnership helps us take the gospel further, equip believers, and stand with the underground church in Iran. Thanks for listening. And as always, let's keep the conversation going, honest, courageous, and unmuted.